And a short time ago, I was joined from Parliament House by the Treasurer, Wayne Swan. Treasurer, will the government return a budget surplus next year at any cost?
Well, we've put in place some pretty tough savings measures in this update to bring the budget back to surplus. Why have we done that? Because we think that's the appropriate setting when your growth is around trend, when you've got low unemployment, when you've got a strong investment pipeline and when you've got contained inflation. So that's why we're coming back to surplus, because that also gives the Reserve Bank maximum flexibility when it comes to interest rates, and I think also sends a really clear message to the world about the strength of our public finances.
There's a huge amount of global uncertainty currently. Surely
Yes.
It's worth having a bit of wiggle room around that surplus target, otherwise you're limiting your options to deal with all sorts of factors outside your control.
No, far from it. I think what we are doing here is sending a message to the world at a time of global uncertainty about the strength of the Australian budget. You see, we're going to grow faster than every other major advanced economy this year and next. And in fact, they would be asking questions as to why we're not coming back to surplus in those conditions. But I do take your point to this extent. We have been very careful in terms of the savings that we've made to make sure we minimise the impact on the growth outlook for the future.
At what point, though, if revenues keep falling, will you say, OK, we can't cut spending any further, so we have to let the surplus slide by a year in the interests of keeping the economy buoyant?
Well, that's hypothetical, so I'm not going to respond to that. But we will put in place the appropriate fiscal settings to ensure there continues to be growth and to support employment.
But the economy is proving softer than both the RBA and the Treasury anticipated. If you keep cutting spending and imposing taxes to reach your goal of having a surplus next year, then there's a risk that you could jeopardise economic growth in the medium term, isn't there?
Well, the consolidation that we're making in this update is the same size as the consolidation that we made in the budget. The difference is that we get to the end result in a different way. And the way in which we put in place our savings is to minimise its overall impact on growth. Some people make the mistake to equate the size of the consolidation with an impact on growth, and the two don't equate. The fact is there's a lesser impact on growth than the size of the consolidation. And we've been very careful to ensure that when we're making savings, we're not directly impacting on growth and jobs.
But nonetheless, in very simple terms, if you're cutting government spending, therefore there's going to be less spending from business, there's going to be less spending from consumers, less consumer confidence. So that's the point I'm driving at, that you run a risk of damaging the economy overall.
Well, there will be differing effects of differing measures when it comes to growth, but I think we are sending a message of confidence by coming back to surplus, and I think in the current environment that's pretty important.
The mid-year forecast doesn't include a figure for the detention centres at Nauru and Manus. The Immigration Department costed them at about $2 billion in advice to the Minister earlier this year, and your own expert panel came up with almost the same figure. Is that the figure that you're working to?
Well, that's commercial in confidence because we are currently having those negotiations with private companies. The minute that those negotiations are completed, we will make those figures public. They are contained within the budget, but they're not published because they are commercial in confidence and it could affect the outcome of negotiations. But we will make those public for all to see. You see, this is part of a comprehensive response to the Houston report. We're keen to put all of that out there, and when the negotiations are finished, of course, it will be out there for all to see.
On the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the disability sector advocate and former Labor heavyweight John Della Bosca says it's disappointing that you haven't factored any funding into this mid-year update, that there's no indication yet as to how you'll pay for it.
Well, we put $1 billion in the last budget for the trial sites. That's very significant.
It's going to cost quite a bit more than that.
Yeah, well, of course it will, and that's well documented and we're acutely aware of it, and we are committed to the scheme. But there's a couple of things have to happen. We've got to have negotiations with the states. We've got a lot more work to do. We've got to go through the establishment of the trial sites. But as we go through to next year's budget, we will account for what we intend to do in the future when it comes to critical aspects of the NDIS and, of course, education reform, otherwise known as Gonski. I made it very clear in my remarks today that the government has a fundamental commitment to those reforms, and the reason why we put in place some substantial structural reforms, not just in this update but in previous budgets, has been to make room for Labor priorities such as the National Disability Insurance Scheme and those important education reforms which go to the heart not just of fairness in Australian society, but I think to the heart of economic prosperity, because education is such a driver of growth as well as fairness.
Well, if Gonski, though, is a fundamental commitment, why isn't there a provision for it in this mid-year update? You say you're waiting on the states, but you know nonetheless that you're going to have to cough up some money for it.
Well, I'm sorry, Lee, but this is just an update. It's actually not the budget. We will, as we do in the normal way, go through our budget process, which is in May next year, and we will fund our commitments in that way.
Should there be a moratorium on political parties announcing big spending policy plans without at the same time explaining how they'll be paid for?
Well, we are explaining how they'll be paid for. We've got $1 billion down already, and we've explained the process that we're going through. I mean,
and where's the rest of that money coming from for Gonski, the other $6 billion or so a year that you need?
Well, that's your figure, but the fact is that we have put in place in this budget some very substantial structural reforms, and they will have big impacts, not just over the forward estimates, but out into the out years and through the remainder of the decade. That is the sort of approach that you must have to make room for big commitments over time. That's what the government's doing. That's what the government did, for example, when we put in place a very substantial increase for the age pension. It's what we've done. That's how we've funded paid parental leave. So when we announce the detail of what we're doing and the money's allocated, we'll also be indicating the reforms and the space that we've created in our budget for those reforms and why they are sustainable for the long term. That's what we're doing. That's in stark contrast to our political opponents who've got a $70 billion crater in their budget bottom line.
Well, you just got to exactly what my point is, that you're saying when we announce these details later, you'll hear what's going to be included. I'm saying at the time you announce, all right, we're going to have this scheme or we're going to do this in education, shouldn't you be able to say to the public, and here's where that money's going to come from?
Well, you've just seen some of the structural reforms announced that are important to creating room for the long term for reforms like Gonski and, of course, the NDIS announced today. But we will need to do more, and I've said that very clearly today as well. So I think we're in screaming agreement about that.
Treasurer Wayne Swan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.